Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's program. Today's program is taking right out of the hypertrophy files, and the hypertrophy files are part of a series of lectures that I produce for you doctors out of the Basic Science series for Chiropractic Continuing Education. And today's program is approved for 6 hours of continuing education in the general category by the Board of Chiropractic Examiners. So welcome to the program and thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoy today's program quite a bit and that you get a lot out of it. The focus of today's program is going to be on two words, and these are two words that I tell almost every one of my patients on almost every single visit that I have with them. And these are some profound words, and you don't have to say really much more than these two words to your patients. And if you're able to get a head nod from your patients after you repeat this mantra to them, you'll know that you're doing the very best thing that you can for them. And this applies to you as well. Today's program is entitled Exercise Recommendations for Chiropractors and Their Patients. And so today's program is directed, first of all, doctors, at you, because I know what your life is like, and I know what it's like to be a chiropractor, because I am a chiropractor, and I've been a chiropractor for 27 years, and I know that being a chiropractor is a physical job. It's a physically demanding, it's a heavy lifting job. So we have those physical demands on us. Also, as respected healthcare authorities, we also serve as role models to our patients. So it's important that we practice what we preach. And so I direct this program first and foremost to you, doctor, and then also to your patients. And the mantra and the two words that I constantly reinforce both to myself and to my patients, and that I want to impart to you and your patients, is to up muscle. Up muscle. It's the philosophy of this program, and it's my sincere opinion that we need to continually focus on increasing the muscle mass content of our body, and this is regardless of age. In fact, as we age through our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, I don't know where you lie on that spectrum, but speaking for myself, I'm probably at the midpoint of that spectrum and inching perhaps slightly past the midpoint of that spectrum. And as we do age, it becomes even more important to focus on upping the muscle mass content of our bodies. So that's the whole purpose of our program today, is to learn how to preserve muscle mass and how to promote and grow new muscle mass regardless of our age, regardless of our physical condition, or regardless of any limitations that we may think that we have that prevent us from doing just that, from building new muscle. So this is called the hypertrophy files, and this is one of several lessons in the hypertrophy files, which is a series of exercise, dietary, and lifestyle techniques designed to promote muscle hypertrophy. So today we're going to talk about lesson number 1 from the hypertrophy files. And today we're going to focus on some exercise techniques involving and focusing on 3 very narrow principles. We're going to narrow this entire concept down to 3 simple, effective, and extremely powerful techniques that you and your patients can implement right away that will tremendously improve and enhance the benefits that you get from standard exercise, whether those be performed in a health club or whether those be performed at home with simple and inexpensive implements. And those 3 simple principles that we're going to focus on in this program include, number 1, the biarticular muscles, the eccentric muscle actions, and the pre-stretch principle. And of course, we'll elaborate over the next 6 hours on these 3 principles. So if you're ready with me, I'd like you to grab your handout materials for your note-taking benefit. Grab you a snack and a drink and get ready to get down to some brass tacks of anatomy, physiology, and the science behind muscle hypertrophy. Now, in order to understand how it is that we're going to find ways to train heavy, we need to understand a couple of principles of muscle contractions and how these 3 different types of muscle fibers are recruited during various activities. And the recruitment of different muscle fiber types during activities follows a principle known as the size principle. And in explaining the size principle to you here, I reference the National Strength and Conditioning Association's textbook, Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. This is out of their 2nd edition book, the most current edition. And on page 97, they describe the size principle as, quote, the recruitment of more and larger motor units as a response to an increased force requirement. So recall that a motor unit is comprised of a single motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it innervates. And motor units come in various sizes. We have small motor units where a single motor neuron innervates a very small number of muscle fibers. Let's say, for example, only 5 individual muscle fibers innervated by one single motor neuron. And also we have very large motor units where one single motor neuron could innervate hundreds of muscle fibers. So according to the size principle, we see the recruitment of more motor units and larger motor units as a response to an increased force requirement. So as force requirements increase, we see the involvement or the recruitment of not only more motor units, but also larger motor units. And they go on to say, quote, that motor units are recruited in order according to their recruitment thresholds and firing rates, which results in a continuum of voluntary force in the agonist muscle. So what does that mean? That means that as we engage in activities that require more and more and more force, such as lifting heavier and heavier and heavier weights, we see the recruitment or the involvement of not only more motor units, but also the larger motor units. And the larger motor units are those motor units consisting primarily of the type 2B muscle fibers. Now this is depicted quite nicely in this diagram, which shows that for activities that require low levels of force production, our muscles rely only on the smallest motor units, which are comprised primarily of your type 1 muscle fiber types. However, as we engage in activities that require increasing amounts of force to complete the activity, we start to see the recruitment of larger and larger and eventually even the largest motor units comprised exclusively of the type 2 and type 2B muscle fiber types. And this makes sense for low-level activities that require only low amounts of force production, such as walking, such as light housekeeping, such as activities of daily living. Only the type 1 endurance fibers are required to fulfill those activities. But for high-intensity, high-force production activities, such as sprinting, such as lifting heavy weights, such as pushing a stuck vehicle out of a ditch, this type of thing requires the largest of the motor units, which consists almost exclusively of your type 2B muscle fiber types. And it's the type 2B muscle fiber types that we have to get to, that we have to target if our goal is to increase the cross-sectional area and the muscle size and fulfill our goal of muscle hypertrophy. So according to the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and further elaborating on the size principle, they state that in order to recruit the high threshold motor units, in other words, the fast twitch muscle fibers, one must engage in tasks that require high force outputs. Now, why do we call these motor units high threshold? Well, they're high threshold because they're not low threshold. In other words, in order to stimulate these motor units, the demand has to be very high. They don't just fire at the drop of a hat with low threshold stimulus. It takes a high stimulus and a high demand to finally get these motor units, which are sitting in reserve and waiting for just such activity, to get them to fire. So we must engage in tasks that require high force outputs. So according to the size principle, as we engage in increasingly intense activity, these small type 1 muscle fibers are recruited first. Then, as the demand of activity increases, the intermediate or type 2A muscle fibers are recruited next if necessary. Then, if necessary, the larger type 2B muscle fibers are finally recruited next, and motor units are progressively recruited up the continuum of the size principle, with heavy activities that require high force outputs and high force production, recruiting all populations of muscle fibers in that order. First the small ones, then the intermediate ones, and then finally, if necessary, the larger type 2B muscle fibers are called in. And this makes sense, and I can give you an example of how this could occur as you go about your daily activities. Imagine, for example, that you are filling up the dog bowl with water, and you have a fairly large dog bowl. Or maybe you're filling up a bucket of water to wash your car. Let's use that as an example. You're filling up a bucket of water because you want to wash a couple of cars. So you take this empty pail and you hold it under the faucet. And as you hold this pail, this empty pail under the hose faucet, because the pail is light, you require only the smallest motor units and the smallest muscle fibers to hold the weight of this negligible bucket. Well, as the bucket starts to fill with water and it gets heavier and heavier, larger motor units are called upon to sustain the weight of the bucket. Now imagine your biceps being flexed and holding this bucket at a right angle to your humerus bone. As the bucket fills up with water and gets heavier and heavier, your capacity to hold that bucket, especially if it's say a 5-gallon bucket, your capacity to hold that bucket diminishes. Whereas you could hold the empty bucket all day, a full bucket you would not. You'd be able to hold it only for a much shorter period of time. And that makes sense. Well, as the bucket gets heavier and heavier, larger and larger motor units are called upon in order to complete this maneuver. Now, there are some exceptions to the size principle. There are some exceptions to this recruitment order of small to intermediate to larger muscle fiber types. Now, it seems that explosive types of movements, such as jumps, such as sprints off of the blocks, or I should say starts off of the blocks, and any movement that's performed in an explosive or very rapid fashion seems to bypass the smaller muscle fibers and instead proceeds directly to recruit the larger type 2B muscle fibers. And then also activities or exercises that involve a heavy eccentric component. And we're going to define eccentric exercise here a little bit. But for our purposes now, know that eccentric exercise involves the lowering of weights versus the lifting of weights. The lifting of weights we describe as concentric exercise or concentric muscle action, but the lowering of weights or the deceleration of loads, which qualifies as eccentric exercise, this seems to be a second exception to the size principle, with eccentric types of exercises bypassing the smaller and intermediate size muscle fibers and preferentially seeming to recruit and activate the larger type 2B muscle fibers. So this further sheds some light into our formula for muscle hypertrophy. So in addition to heavy exercise, we're going to incorporate these last two components, the explosive movements and eccentric muscle actions, in order to preferentially recruit the large type 2B muscle fibers. So part of our conclusion is that it's the fast glycolytic fibers, the type 2B muscle fibers, that are capable of the most hypertrophy. So if our goal is maximum hypertrophy, the focus of our training has to be on training number one, that's heavy, meaning it's 65 to 85% of our one repetition maximum. Number two, that our training has to be short duration, meaning less than 1 minute in duration. And number three, our exercise has to involve high intensity or explosive type movements. And number four, very fast contraction times. Now this is important because while all three types of muscle fibers, meaning the type 1s, the type 2As, and the type 2Bs, all are capable of some hypertrophy, it's the type 2Bs or the fast glycolytic that grow the most because they are the largest to begin with. So we're going to be focusing on the type 2B muscle fiber types. Now, for those of us that are in full-time chiropractic practice and we think about engaging in heavy and short duration and high intensity activities, explosive activities, that may be well and good for us, and it may be well and good for general populations. What about special populations? What about people with issues such as shoulder pain or back pain or orthopedic conditions? What about the so-called rehabilitation population? Well, it's my opinion and my position, and it's been my experience as a chiropractor and as a strength and conditioning coach, that heavy training is still necessary, but we have to make modifications to the training so that our patients can train heavy without fear of aggravation of existing injury or without causing new injury. And one of the main ways that we make modifications is through manipulations of some of the different types of variables that we just discussed, one of which is through manipulation of range of motion. And later on in the program I have some videos for you to show you how we can still train heavy through manipulation of range of motion. And one of the videos that I share with you later on in the program is a gentleman aged 75 years old with a recent shoulder left shoulder rotator cuff repair, who, after going through initial rehabilitation, has now resumed some type of heavy training in order to preserve his type 2B muscle fibers, but we make modifications for him through manipulation of range of motion. Other variables that we can manipulate include manipulation of the weight, manipulation of the explosiveness of the maneuver, and through manipulation of the eccentric portion of the range of motion. And I'll give examples as to how we do that as we go through some of the various exercises later on in the program. So, we must train heavy if we want to preserve and enhance and increase the type 2B muscle fibers. Now, why do I say that it's necessary throughout our lifetime to always focus on muscle hypertrophy? Well, the reason is because, like a garden, if you do nothing to take care of your garden will develop weeds, correct? Well, similarly, if you do nothing to preserve and enhance and increase your muscle mass of your body, just like your garden, your body will develop weeds. The muscular system will develop weeds, and the weeds of the muscular system is what's known as sarcopenia. Sarcopenia, meaning if you don't use it, you will lose it. It's the old adage, use it or lose it. And sarcopenia takes place even with muscle training as we age. So really the fight that we're talking about is the fight to preserve our muscle mass. So let's define sarcopenia and go through a few of scientific studies to further convince ourselves of the necessity of always working toward increasing our muscular mass. And this is a study I want to quote from the Journal of Geriatric Physical Therapy, and it's a 2009 study which talks about the necessity for always working towards more and more muscle hypertrophy. So first of all, sarcopenia simply means the loss of muscle mass generally due to aging. So the journal states that sarcopenia is a consequence of aging. This atrophic event, that's like the word atrophy, muscle atrophy or loss of muscle. This atrophic event is responsible for decrease in strength and associated functional deficits seen in the aging adult. So here you have the crux and crumb of it. Decreasing function or functional deficit as we age is due to sarcopenia, due to loss of muscle mass, which leads to loss of strength. And this is exactly what it is we want to prevent. So the journal concluded that sarcopenia is a multifactorial consequence of aging that will affect many adults. However, resistance training, which is what we're going to get into here today, doctors, resistance training is the most effective and safest intervention to attenuate or recover some of the loss of muscle mass and strength that accompanies aging. Now, while most of us do not aspire to look like our bodybuilder friend, Mr. Olympia Phil Heath, or we don't desire to be competitive bodybuilders, the necessity of muscle hypertrophy is a lifelong pursuit, if only to prevent sarcopenia, the natural age-related decline of the muscle mass of the body. Now, in order to prevent sarcopenia, we must train heavy in order to prevent the loss of and to preserve the type 2B muscle fibers. Now, the loss of type 2B muscle fibers occurs preferentially with aging. In other words, with sarcopenia, sarcopenia primarily targets the type 2B muscle fibers. And this conclusion that we must train heavy is the combined conclusion of many scientific studies now, and I want to share some of these studies with you here. The first one of which is a 2001 study published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, and the title of the study was that short-term heavy resistance training eliminates age-related deficits in muscle mass and strength in healthy older males. Now, those are some strong words. I want to repeat that title. It says that short-term heavy resistance training eliminates, not slows down, not attenuates, not curbs, but it eliminates age-related deficits in muscle mass and strength in healthy older males. So there you have it. If we can ourselves engage in heavy resistance training, if we can get our patients to somehow get involved in a program that involves heavy resistance training, we can eliminate many of the age-related deficits associated with sarcopenia. So the conclusion of this study, which is our overriding philosophy in this program, is that short-term heavy resistance training in healthy older men is sufficient to overcome deficits in muscle mass and strength when compared to healthy younger men. Another study published in Medicine and Science in Sport and Exercise is a fascinating study. And what this study sought to find the answer to was what is the best method for preserving strength and preserving power? What type of exercise program should we engage in if our long-term goal is to maintain our strength and to maintain our capacity to produce power and to basically maintain our type 2B muscle fibers and stave off the negative effects of sarcopenia? So what they did, and this was a study that took place over 7 years and concluded in 1996, is kind of a classic study in this area of sarcopenia. They took 3 groups of men aged between 70 and 74 years of age. 3 groups. Now, group 1 was a group of men who were basically untrained. They had undergone no physical training for a period of time greater than 50 years. So imagine that. No actual training for more than 50 years. The second group of men were endurance-trained master athletes, men who had engaged in endurance activities such as biking, such as running, such as rowing, etc., for greater than 50 years. And they were master athletes. And then the group 3 were strength-trained master athletes, athletes who had been involved with strength training for greater than 50 years. And they put these people through a variety of different activities to determine their capacity for producing power and their capacity for exerting strength and lifting heavy weights. And the purpose of the study was to measure maximum muscle contraction force and also muscle mass, in other words, cross-sectional area of muscle. And they stated that maximum muscle contraction force and muscle mass are both reduced during the natural aging process. Long-term training may be used to attenuate this age-related loss in muscle function and muscle size. And they use the word here attenuate. And attenuate basically means to reduce, to soften, to make less, to buffer. Now our prior study used the word eliminate. This study is using the word attenuate. So that indicates to us that perhaps even with long-term heavy training, we may see some sarcopenia or some loss of type 2 muscle fibers. But long-term resistance training is the only way to buffer or to reduce or to soften this negative blow. So what they did is they tested each of these three groups on several factors. Number one was their maximum isometric quadricep strength, maximum strength of the quadriceps, the rate at which they could produce force, and then also the muscle fiber composition and size, meaning what's the muscle fiber composition? Are they primarily type 1 fibers, type 2A fibers, type 2B fibers, etc. in the quadriceps? So they studied maximum isometric quadricep strength, the rate of force development, and muscle fiber composition and size were studied in elderly individuals chronically exposed, meaning greater than 50 years, to either an endurance training program, a strength training program, or those groups of men who were basically untrained. And what they found was that the endurance and strength trained athletes showed greater maximum muscle contraction force than did the untrained group. And does this make sense? This makes absolute sense, that men who engage in long-term exercise, whether it be endurance or strength training exercise, are able to produce greater maximum muscle contraction force than those men who engage in absolutely no exercise. This makes intuitive sense. Also, the rate of force development was elevated in the strength group compared to the untrained group, and the strength group also demonstrated greater type 2 fiber cross-sectional area than did either the untrained or the endurance-trained athletes. However, the proportion of type 1 fibers, the endurance fibers, was greater in the endurance athletes compared with the untrained and the strength-trained athletes. So, what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that muscle fiber size and mechanical muscle performance, particularly the rate of force development, were consistently elevated in aged individuals exposed to lifelong strength training. And they stated that this relative preservation in muscle morphology and function may provide an important physical reserve capacity to retain muscle mass and function above the critical threshold for independent living at old age. And so why do you think it is that the rate of force development was greater in the strength trained group compared to even the endurance group? Well, the reason is because the strength trained group had more preserved type 2B muscle fibers. And it's the type 2B muscle fibers that are going to be the functional fiber types that are going to get us through to a ripe old age with high functional capacity. So the results of the study were basically just that, and that is that maximum isometric force is best maintained in endurance and strength master athletes compared to controls, right? And muscle fiber size, meaning the cross-sectional area, and power are best maintained in strength master athletes. So the final conclusion is that the type 2B fibers are preserved by strength, hypertrophy, and power training and are not preserved by endurance training. Now, some of you out there listening to this may consider yourselves to be endurance athletes, and that's okay. As I stated in the beginning of this program, no one component of the fitness profile is any better than any other. However, as this study clearly shows, comparing strength athletes to master-trained endurance athletes, only the strength athletes had preserved muscle fiber size, and only the strength master-trained athletes had preserved strength and capacity for producing power of the muscles. And it's my philosophy, in my opinion, that the capacity to produce power and the capacity to produce strength are what are the critical components that we need to live a functional, active, and busy lifestyle well up into our 60s, 70s, as this group was in their 70s, and even into our 80s and beyond, if that is your goal. Okay, so let's conclude our review then of the three different types of muscle fibers before we get into some nuts and bolts of what are we going to do. Okay, now that we're convinced that we need to train heavy and we need to train hard and we need to preserve our muscle fiber types, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page now regarding the different actions and activities of these three main muscle fiber types. So remember now that the type 1 muscle fiber types are the slow oxidative, the type 2As are fast oxidative, and the type 2Bs are the fast glycolytic. And for those of you that have the handout materials, you might just take a pen and circle that last category of fast glycolytic fibers, because those are the fibers on which we're going to focus here. So we're going to focus on activities that involve fast speed of contraction, such as short-term intense or powerful movements, such as hitting a baseball or sprinting or doing heavy weight training activities. And we're going to try and reverse the recruitment order, whereas ordinarily these muscle fiber types, these type 2B muscle fibers, are recruited last according to the size principle. We're going to engage in activities such as explosive type activities and eccentric muscle action activities to reverse the recruitment order and preferentially target these type 2B muscle fiber types. And this is an interesting table for those of you that have your handout materials, and those of you that are watching this on the PowerPoint presentation. It shows actually a cross-section of some muscle tissue, and shows that indeed in this particular cross-sectional muscle sample, the three muscle fiber types are present, with slow oxidative fibers staining red due to high myoglobin content, and the fast glycolytic fibers, the largest of the fibers, staining white due to lack of myoglobin content. And as we said earlier, and as indicated in this diagram, our fast glycolytic fibers, these type 2B muscle fibers, are going to be involved with rapid, intense movements and movements of short duration. So let's get into now some specific techniques as to how it is we're going to activate these fibers in a safe, effective, and efficient manner. In conclusion, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I hope you enjoyed this program. Now you have a 20-question examination that I need you to complete and either fax or email back to me. My fax number is on the top of the examination form, and just as soon as I receive your examination form, I will provide you with a certificate of completion that you can use for your Board of Chiropractors continuing education credit. For now, I want to leave you with the website for chiropractors, which is entitled EZ CiropracticCEU.com. We're always coming up with new programs, so check the website frequently for new programs designed to help you succeed as a chiropractor. Again, Dr. Perry Carpenter wishing you great success. If there's ever anything I can do to help you, feel free to call. Again, thanks for being with me on this program, and best of success.